Fascists and Nazis are the same thing, and they are definitively of the far right. This fact is so universally accepted that it's rarely investigated. But that's exactly why an investigation is warranted. In fact, fascism first emerged from the revolutionary left. Its members marched under red flags on May Day, and its mandate focused on the state control of industry, collectivization, high tariffs, and workers' councils. Its main theorists were Alfredo Rocco and Giovanni Gentile, a pair of committed Marxists who culled ideas from Hegel, Saint-Simon, Nietzsche, and Georges Sorel. Their truly radical innovation was to reject the international revolution by focusing on the pre-existing administrative structure of the nation-state, and their economic plan was to be based on the theory of syndicalism. Under this system, while industries remained in private hands, they came under complete government regulation. Prices, quantities, and patterns of distribution were to be determined not by the market, but by the state. In Italy, the theories of fascism were put into practice by Benito Mussolini. He was born to Alessandro, a committed socialist who named his son after three revolutionary heroes. Mussolini's father was a member of the First International and a personal friend of Karl Marx. Mussolini himself was a personal friend of Lenin. He embarked on a career as a left-wing journalist before falling in with a group of Bolsheviks and radicals in Switzerland. He founded a paper called Class War, the journal of the Italian Socialist Party's extreme wing, and declared that I am and shall remain a socialist, and my convictions will never change. They are bred into my very bones. He was a committed Red who had helped organize the communist revolutions that swept through Europe in 1917, before forming his new organization on more nationalistic lines. And he cited Georges Sorel, the radical Marxist and class war enthusiast, as his movement's true prophet. The movement was named after the fasces, the symbol of the Roman Republic, which indicated unity and strength. If one rod was broken, the rest would survive. It was a collectivist ideology, entirely removed from any individualist or capitalistic statements of the right. Mussolini's fascist manifesto called for a minimum wage, workers' representation in government, the repeal of noble titles, swinging progressive taxation to squeeze the rich, the expansion of the franchise, a sweeping program of nationalization, and provision for the schooling of the proletariat. Even his final days were spent colluding with socialists and communists while still denouncing the bourgeoisie. And when sentenced to death, his compatriot Bonifaci, another friend of Lenin's, cried out, "Long live Mussolini! Long live socialism!" In Britain, Mussolini's thuggish blackshirts were emulated by Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. But Mosley, while he had flirted briefly with the Tory party, was a Labour MP, and his movement was run on thoroughly left-wing lines. They too had a populist socialist message which opposed governments in thrall to a wealthy elite, while demanding action over the housing and working conditions of the nation's poor. Though it must be admitted that the Labour movement widely opposed him too. So far, so left-wing. But what about the Nazis? Now, it's pretty widely known that Hitler, in his youth, was a tramp. So it's peculiar that it's almost universally accepted that he sided with privileged elites against the underdog everyman. Well, let's take a look at the actual evidence. Hitler joined a movement called the German Labour Party. He was attracted to that by a talk given by Gottfried Feder, and Feder was widely acknowledged as a supporter of the socialist revolution which briefly transformed Munich into a Soviet-style commune. The subject of the talk that day was how and by what means is capitalism to be eliminated? And Hitler was won over by Feder's attack on the increasing power of banks, corporations, and department stores. Mein Kampf is particularly revealing in this regard. Hitler was profoundly affected by the penury he endured in Vienna, and much of the book focuses on the social problem, the poverty trap, and the inequality he saw all around him, which he was repulsed by. He also admitted to having loathed the privileged Habsburg regime since his youth, and he railed against the slow elimination of the personal control of vested interests and the gradual transference of the whole economic structure into the hands of joint stock companies. Hitler lamented the impact of money-grabbing capitalism and despaired over how the German state railways are now to be turned over to international capitalists. His solution to such issues was to make sure that capital remained subservient to the state and to safeguard the social rights of the workers. Hardly views which sound terribly right-wing. It was his intense aversion to capitalism that informed Hitler's hatred of the Jews. His animus stemmed from a perception of the Jewish role as a merchant, banker, landlord, newspaper mogul, and capitalist. And for this, Hitler justified the series of historical pogroms as a legitimate reaction against their greed and mercantile activities. They were, in essence, a privileged 1%. Hitler argued that the Jews had advanced their commercial interests since biblical times, specializing in exploitation while thriving off the toil of others. They effectively acted as a parasite on the societies in which they lived. He claimed that only with the entrance of the Jew did that feeling of estrangement between employers and employees begin, which at a later date led to the political class struggle. This theory encapsulates the Marxist belief in alienation. It sounds like a banner headline from the socialist worker. Hitler subscribed completely to the Rothschild world conspiracy. He believed that through Freemasonry, the Jew grew to control governments, the press, the stock exchange, banking, and international high finance. This malign plot resulted in him pulling the strings behind the scenes and directing international policies on a worldwide scale. He was certain that this cabal lay at the heart of the inequality he campaigned against. The rise of the Jew meant the small artisan worker disappeared, and the factory labourer, who took his place, was effectively disinherited and unable to provide for his old age. He was determined to smash this privileged system that ruled Germany and focus on improving the job prospects and material conditions of the working man. And he was as good as his word on those claims. The 25-point programme of the Nazis, which was issued on 24th of February 1920, called for equality, rent controls, the nationalisation of industry, profit sharing in heavy industries, old age pensions, start-up schemes for small businesses, land reform, and prescriptions on usury. And the Nazis were also radical eco-warriors who opposed animal cruelty, passed environmental protection laws and clean air acts, banned smoking on public transport, and recommended organic farming, rural living, and vegetarianism. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, championed homeopathy and herbal remedies. And Himmler was also obsessed by natural, holistic remedies and insisted on the spread of herb gardens in Nazi institutions, while virulently opposing hunting and any form of animal cruelty. As the Nazi movement grew, two distinct groups emerged within its ranks. One was centred in Munich and sought to represent the likes of artisans and lower middle-class shopkeepers. But the north was dominated by a much larger youth movement that focused on hostility to big corporations, department stores, and finance capital. It called for a revolution in social reform and an appeal to the working man. The most prominent figure in the northern faction was Gregor Strasser, who gathered a clique around himself that included his brother Otto, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels. Their National Socialism focused on anti-capitalism and demanded the nationalization of heavy industry, profit sharing, and land reform. Strasser wrote that we National Socialists are enemies, deadly enemies of the present capitalist system with its exploitation of the economically weak, and we are resolved under all circumstances to destroy this system. Goebbels also attacked the money pigs of capitalist democracy and made clear that, as socialists, we are opponents of the Jews because we see in the Hebrew the incarnation of capitalism, of the misuse of this nation's funds. Hitler did not entirely commit to their program, but he did not repudiate it either, and he put Strasser and Goebbels in charge of propaganda, an indication of the significance of their manifesto. The brown shirts also played a huge role in the Nazi movement. They focused on working class agitation against privileged elites to complete the National Socialist Revolution. Ernst Röhm was even more radically far left than Strasser was, and was executed less for ideological reasons than because Hitler saw him as a potential rival. Contrary to popular perception, the Nazis were not financed by big business. They were primarily a proletarian movement that opened up cells in working class institutions, effectively their own form of trade unions, and they agitated for and supported strikes. It's true that Hitler made efforts to widen the Nazi appeal to win power, because he was a pragmatist, but these leftist roots cannot be denied. The Nazis had been clear for a decade that they were an anti-establishment revolutionary movement, and it was their opposition to capitalism that saw support for the party surge in the wake of the Wall Street crash. Privileged elites, the capitalist structures, and the free market seemed to have failed, so the people looked for different answers. When they seized control of the state, the Nazis implemented the robustly left-wing policies of the famed economist John Maynard Keynes, which merged with the adoption of Italy's syndicalist financial line. This provided the basis for both Volkswagen and the Autobahn, with large state-led projects proving the order of the day. Hitler allowed private ownership, just as Mussolini had, but that independence was critical on it serving the needs of the state, and big business was compelled to finance the universal healthcare, rent controls, maternity leave, pensions, price controls, and minimum wage introduced under the Nazis. Under their system, centralized planning replaced the market, and buyers and sellers were no longer permitted to base their economic activities on the laws of supply and demand. Instead, the state regulated production quotas, allocated resources, decided who produced what and where, and set the prices for what they sold. Some entrepreneurs were left alone, but others, like the Rothschilds and Skoda, had their assets confiscated. In 1934, Hitler gloated to an enthusiastic Mussolini that capitalism has run its course. 4 years earlier, he had assured Otto Strasser that I am a socialist, and a very different kind of socialist from your friend Count Reventlow. I was once an ordinary working man. I would not allow my chauffeur to eat worse than I eat myself. Strasser had accused him of conciliation with the bourgeois parties of the right, and it was the worst insult that one Nazi could throw to another. But even Strasser would not accuse Hitler of being right-wing himself, because that was anathema to the Nazis. They were very clear which side of the divide they belonged to. They were not alone. It was widely accepted at the time that Hitler was a socialist, even if he was considered an undesirable and uninvited guest by many of that persuasion. Harold Nicolson was among the first students of fascism and concluded of Nazism that it is certainly a socialist experiment in that it destroys individuality. He judged it to be a kind of militarized socialism, while Julian Huxley, the half-brother of Aldous, concluded that Nazism was a shortcut towards the unified socialist state which should be our goal. A shortcut it may have been, and there were fears that it would give socialism a bad name. But no contemporary suggested that the movement was conservative or right-wing in any way. The leftist German poet Horst Wessel, an avid supporter of Nazism, who was christened a socialist Christ by Goebbels, would certainly have agreed. And in The Lion and the Unicorn, which he wrote in 1941, George Orwell, who harboured no doubt that Nazi Germany was economically socialist, argued that the speedy collapse of France the previous year proved that competition was inefficient and that socialism was superior to capitalism. The event proved to him that a planned economy is stronger than a planless one. The West, he argued, should learn from Hitler's example that planning works and the chaotic scramble of the free market does not. Orwell further claimed that any who argued that the Nazis were not genuine socialists was simply in denial of an incontrovertible truth. Now, it's undeniable that as they moved further through their successful careers, Hitler and Mussolini abandoned some of the idealism of their youth. But their left-wing socialist roots and overarching economic approaches cannot be denied. So why do so many people believe Hitler was right-wing today? The reason why is because Stalin told them to think this nearly a century ago. It's not a terribly good reason. The fact is, there was a violent split between factions that were competing for the same electorate, and the left largely sided with Stalin, who tarred all his opponents as right-wing. And the tag stuck. If you've enjoyed this film, please like and subscribe. And if you're interested in these topics, I've written 2 books which go into them in great amount of detail. They're called The Tyranny of the Left, and they're available on the links below. Please feel free to pick them up and let me know what you think. Thank you.